female microbiome versus a male's microbiome? Are they fundamentally quite different?
We do see differences between men and women, and this tends to actually happen when girls hit puberty. We see this kind of divergence between men and women. We see through menopause where we see this kind of fluctuating decline in sex hormones. That microbiome then becomes more similar to the man's microbiome as well.
Emily Leeming is a gut health scientist and dietitian,
exploring how the microbiome shapes our mood, metabolism, and mindset.
The more sex that we have with somebody who's got a good gut microbiome, the better our own gut microbiome will be.
And you're transferring in just by kissing someone for more than 10 seconds.
Did I say 80 million?
80 million microbes from one mouth to another. The people that you live with and particularly are intimate with, you have a more similar microbiome with them. Pick your partner wisely.
And there's a part in your book that talks about emerging research that shows that men's gut microbes can influence sperm production and fertility.
We see that in mice studies, for example, that by giving a mouse a healthier gut microbiome, their sperm kind of dramatically increases in numbers and health. There was a great study that came out a couple of years ago that showed that 6 servings of fermented food a day increased microbial diversity. So everything that we touch and eat has live microbes in it, and apple has 100 million live microbes. Gut health doesn't have to be complicated. I think it's been way overcomplicated. Let's just go back to what are the small important things that you can be doing that completely intuitively fit within what are the key principles that you can apply.
Firstly, I want to say thank you to tuning in and listening to the show. It means a huge amount. And connecting with all of you is something that I absolutely love as part of this journey of growing the show. One of my biggest goals of 2025 is doubling the reach of this show. And I can't do that without your support. So I would love to ask you a favor. If you can press subscribe or follow on whichever platform you listen to. This helps us reach more people. And for me, elevating women in science is so fundamental and ethical and scientific information. So if you feel the show empowers you and gives you the information that you've been seeking, I would love to ask a favor in return and to hit that subscribe button and help me reach the goal that I've set for the show of 2025. Thank you. Emily, welcome to Live Well, Be Well. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thanks so much. I love to be here. It's great.
So we're going to divulge everything on the gut microbiome today. And it's quite an interesting one because we've had a lot of conversations on the gut microbiome on this podcast. And every time I seem to come away with something new. So when I was looking through your book, the thing that drew me the most attention, where I really, really want to start, which I think is becoming more explicit than ever before, is the differences between men and women. So then I thought, well, the gut microbiome, is there a difference between a man and a woman? So that's my first question. Is there a female microbiome versus a male's microbiome? Are they fundamentally quite different?
So we do see differences between men and women, and this tends to actually happen when girls hit puberty. We see this kind of divergence between men and women. And this is a lot because we have this relationship between our kind of female sex hormones like estrogen with the gut microbiome. But obviously, I think it's also the fact that, our bodies, we've got our reproductive system that's kind of different. And our microbiome is so in tune with what's happening with our kind of body systems. So we see this kind of slight difference happening. And I think I really want to clarify it. It's not to say that one is kind of quote unquote better than the other. I'm not sure we'd have a kind of a kind of microbiome war over that. Mine's better than yours. But then we see through menopause where we see this kind of fluctuating decline in sex hormones, that microbiome then becomes more similar to the man's microbiome as well. And I think the other thing that's really interesting is that women's kind of guts are also kind of slightly different from men. So you've got a slightly different length in the colon, for example.
Wow.
So you've got kind of, perhaps maybe there's a difference because of that as well, which the colon, the lower large intestine being where the home of these kind of trillions of tiny living organisms, that are microbes that make up your gut microbiome. And that, that's probably also maybe contributing a little bit to the differences. But I think this also ties back to what about in disease, and conditions.
Yes.
And I kind of feel, it's quite difficult. I think it becomes a little bit too simplistic to talk about what types of microbes that you have. I think probably noticed throughout the book, I don't think I even mention any names of microbes, barely.
I was happy to see that, by the way.
And because the reason for that is because, we see relationships between different microbes, being different in men and different in women. And we're seeing differences, whether, living in London versus living in a different country or different continent. I think it's really difficult for us to say, in this certain disease, this goes up and this goes down. And we know that unanimously across the board. And I think actually it's about what are those microbes doing? What are they producing? What are they making? And that's the thing that's having an impact on our health.
You can see me scrolling through this book because I wrote some of the notes down, but not all of them, when I was researching this last night. And I really want to get into the men's microbiome as well, because I found some really interesting points that you said in there. But because we started with women and estrogen, I have to just pick up on that. And you said it's an important regulator to work with estrogen with your gut microbiome. And obviously that connects a lot to menopause when your estrogen levels drop, which we know have a massive effect on our health and women's health and how are their brains functioning and how they're feeling. If we struggled hormonally with our levels of estrogen or sex hormones in general, does that impact our gut microbiome as a woman before menopause?
Yeah, so I think we see that there's this kind of two-way relationship. So it's not just that the microbes are influencing the levels of estrogen, but it's also that, having your estrogen levels, that kind of is having a knock-on effect on your gut microbiome. I think I have to caveat with this is that this is a really new, exciting area of research. The gut microbiome, we only started researching 20 years ago. We had maybe a handful of studies. And then we now have about 60, 70,000 research papers that have come out. And then when we're looking at this, it's only the last, when it comes to the brain particularly, it's the last couple of years. And so when we're looking at women, we're looking at this pattern of what we see versus an intervention of this causes that. So what we tend to see is this kind of relationship that people who have menopause tend to have a less diverse gut microbiome, which is a kind of, the best marker that we have at the MAU for what a healthy gut microbiome is. And that, therefore, we've got this kind of potentially this key window that if we're looking after our gut health and menopause, it could maybe be a kind of more important time for us to help that. And could there be a relationship there between managing menopause symptoms? And we see that in the research as well, that people who tend to eat a more plant-rich diet tend to have less menopause symptoms. But whether that's a knock-on effect or whether that's just something that's giving us signals to we need to dive into this more.
Well, I do just find it completely fascinating because, as you said, the research is still really early. But I think if we can try and explore preventative measures as much as possible, looking at helping diversify your gut microbiome isn't something that's worrying. It's something that's actually relatively positive. Whether we know if that's going to have a direct impact or not, it seems a no-brainer for me, for one to explore that and try to start connecting dots together. The one thing that I found really interesting is that you wrote mums with a lower diversity of gut bacteria and a fewer certain good bacteria are more likely to deliver their babies earlier.
Yeah. So again, is this a kind of signal? And we see that, and I think this goes back to also, with diet being a kind of key impact on our gut microbiome, is that then that, the mum's not necessarily got, the right nutrition stores, that having an impact on the gut microbiome. We know during pregnancy that the mum's gut microbes are producing molecules that then kind of cross into the baby and kind of support the baby in that way. So again, these little insights from the research at the moment of is this, really impactful? And I think there's a few other studies that I mentioned as well, that kind of just giving us these kind of little nudges and cues that we can then take and explore further. I mean, this is real kind of new emerging science. Yeah.
Well, fecal microbiota transplants they're also very relatively new, and mostly with people that struggle with inflammatory bowel disease or anything that's very kind of very serious when it becomes people's bowel health. And I love that you wrote in this chapter on the female microbiome with the gut story, a newspaper featured a man who had a fecal microbiota transplant from his mum in an attempt to improve his symptoms of inflammatory bowel disease. Whilst his symptoms had dramatically improved, he also started to experience his mum's menopause symptoms of hot flushes and brain fog. Scientists still need to test to see if this is true or not, but it's interesting all the same. I found that quite fascinating.
Yeah, and I'm very excited for the next couple of years in research, because I think menopause research has been, absolutely not given enough funding at all. I mean, it's diabolical.
I'm excited for you, but I'm also worried because, a lot of this is now being removed, sadly, on the American side of women's health, which is, I think, we're going to see a surprisingly worrying low dip in any research towards women.
Yeah, and I mean, this has had a knock-on effect in the research that I do at King's College London already, because we work closely with Harvard, and we've had, even yesterday, conversations around how can we make sure that we're still getting, we're very worried about the funding that we've got, and we're looking at early onset colorectal cancer, and they've got microbiome and diet. So I think, this is it's very easy to tear things down. It's going to be much harder to put it back into place. So I think, what's happening in the US is going to have ramifications around the world, and very, very concerned about it.
For women's health. Especially, which is a big thing.
Diversity, absolutely looking at, I think there's really key women, and, looking at kind of diversity in of different populations as well.
Definitely.
Really problematic.
Yeah, if you're a white male, you'll be fine. Let's go on to the male gut microbiome on that face. You talk about how male gut health, or their microbiomes, interact with testosterone. So they're kind of predominant sex hormone. Can you explain how the gut health actually influences male hormones?
So again, it's this kind of relationship, kind of a bit like kind of estrogen, and we see that in my studies, for example, that by giving a mouse a kind of healthier gut microbiome, their sperm kind of dramatically increases in numbers and health.
Yeah, well, they have bigger balls. When you gave older male mice probiotic yogurt, they had bigger balls and they grew more hair and levels of testosterone.
So you've got luscious locks. I think when people say, what do you think the future of the gut microbiome is? And I wonder if we're all just going to be banking, having a stool bank for the future, so that we get our kind of capitalised on our more healthy microbiome when we're more youthful. Or we have some kind of probably stallions of men who are donating their, with luscious locks and eminent sperm, who are then donating to other people. But perhaps that's all a bit of a joke, really. But there's lots of other things that will be more important.
Well, one thing that is important, and I find this this is a really interesting area for me, because I think for so long women were always seen, if there was an infertility problem, we always looked at the woman very, very quickly. However, infertility rates in men are dramatically rising for a copious amount of reasons. There's obviously not one. There's so many confounding variables to why this is happening. But I do find it really interesting now that I think as women may be going to fertility clinics getting checked, men are now also doing the same. And a lot of men are struggling, sadly, with their fertility. And there's a part in your book that talks about emerging research that shows that men's gut microbes can influence sperm production and fertility. So this is quite interesting, which is something we might have looked at.
I think when it comes to, fertility and babies and children, a lot of the research has, not to say that, but that area of research has looked at the relationship with the mother and not necessarily with the father. And so these kind of cohorts where they're tracking these children over time from birth, and now like bringing in that relationship with the father and seeing kind of, because we need that understanding that, again, from fertility, but also through kind of childhood development. And, with the gut microbiome, for example, we see the kind of mother's microbes are kind of still in their children's, present in the children's guts, kind of much late in life, 80 years old, for kind of a couple of people in a certain study. And that's also where you're getting your microbes, from birth. It's from that skin contact with the mum. But now it's like, well, what about the dad? Because that hasn't been collected. But of course, it's with the dad as well. Like having that skin contact is then, getting that transmission of microbes from the dad's skin to the baby as well. And likely also later in life, that's still being kind of a few being present and just seeing that relationship, that gift that you get at birth from both your parents.
Yeah, and you mentioned a part in here about fibre-fed healthy mice to sick mice, doubled their sperm count and boosted their sperm swimming power, a sign of healthy egg-seeking sperm by 20-fold, by transplanting the gut microbiome from basically mice that were fed fibre food. Your favourite F word.
Yes, my favourite F word.
So do you think that, I mean, I know I'm not trying to say that this is like a one-all solution, but I really do think that sometimes we can become very reductionist in just thinking about the medical side of things and not always combining it with the holistic side. You know, I guess from reading that one piece of research, again, it's not a meta-analysis. Again, we can't draw a succinct conclusion, but there's not going to be any harm to thinking, okay, well, if I'm, you know, a man who does have low sperm count and I am struggling to conceive with my partner, maybe adding some more fibre into my diet could be a good preventative step.
Yeah, and I think, you know, if we step back and actually look at the wider research in terms of, you know, nutrition as a whole, you know, we know that's really important. And I think, you know, I talk quite often about the gut microbiome being like a piece of the puzzle in your health, and actually, you know, really recognizing the impact of food, that you're having almost this twofold benefit from the food you're eating. You're getting 92% of the nutrients from the food you eat are absorbed in your small intestine, which is kind of that first long tube pipe that happens after your kind of swirling sac of acid, which is your stomach. And only then, whatever's left over is then falling on the table of your gut microbiome. So you're getting that kind of the nutrients that, you know, will be helpful for male fertility. And then also, you know, is actually this action of the gut microbiome. And that's, you know, obviously a kind of newer and developing. And of course, these are my studies. You know, it's really difficult for us to then say, is this, you know, de facto in humans? But again, yeah, sometimes the research translates, sometimes doesn't. But I think it makes sense in the bigger picture when we're talking about nutrition.
Well, I don't think
there's a relationship there.
Have more fibre in your diet and some probiotic yogurt is harmful health advice to think about.
No.
You know what it is? It's
yeah.
kind of looking at this and saying, well, okay, we're not going to say this is going to maybe entirely solve your solution, but if a man is listening and he's just received a low sperm count, this could be one productive step, right? To kind of introduce.
And I think when we know that the microbiome is, you know, yes, it's helping you digest your food, it's, you know, making certain vitamins, but it's also influencing all the other areas of your body and systems. And this is what we're seeing in relationship with the gut microbiome, all these different areas. And it's kind of how impactful that is probably, you know, as again, it's about this holistic aspect, all these things together. So looking after one key piece of the puzzle amongst everything else.
Yeah. So I'm going to move on to, within this part, something that I'm sure everyone would love to hear, which is sex.
Great.
Because I think people always want to hear about sex.
Perfect. Let's
sex
talk about it.
So I found something really fascinating in this part. As you can tell, I was obsessed with the male and female gut microbiome because it is new, interesting research.
Yes.
And I'm all for human connection. And within human connection, obviously, sexual intimacy is a big part within partners. You write that during sex, there's a microbial exchange between partners. Can you talk about this? What's happening when we're having sex and we're transferring?
We're transferring lots of stuff, right?
Yeah, talk to me.
We're having a happy time. And I think we've got to recognise that the microbiome, so we talk a lot about the gut microbiome. So this collection of tiny living microbes that live in your gut. But we also have microbes all over our skin. There's a vaginal microbiome. And then also for men, there's kind of this, you know, in the kind of pipe, the urethra kind of microbiome as well. And so there's this kind of change of bodily fluids. Also in your mouth. I mean, you're transferring just by kissing someone for more than 10 seconds.
Yeah, did I say 80 million?
Yeah, 80 million microbes from one mouth to another. Again, to zoom back, the people that you live with and particularly are intimate with, you have a more similar microbiome with them than you do with kind of friends and family and various levels. So that's all kind of, you know, pick your partner wisely. But during sex, there's then this kind of back and forth between the vaginal microbiome, obviously depending how much you're using protection, and also kind of the man as well. And I think, you know, this is, again, a new piece of research that's come out in the last few months looking at bacterial vaginosis, which is this kind of infection that women can get that are very common. And researchers have talked, and I think lots of clinicians and everybody has talked for a really long time saying, but why is this coming back? This is coming back. I'm taking the antibiotics. I'm taking the medication. This keeps coming back for me. And surely it's because my partner is harbouring it. And therefore I'm then getting reinfected. And they've now shown that that is the case, and actually you need to be targeting both parts of the couple to be then knocking that on the head. And again, I really hope that we'd learned that sooner. But again, a new interesting thing that I think is so impactful for many people.
Iron is one of the most common deficiencies that I see in clinic, especially in women. And it's not just about feeling tired. Low iron can impact your energy, your focus, your mood, and even your immune system. It's something we really need to be aware of, because if left untreated, iron deficiency can become very serious. Now, UK data shows that around 20 to 35% of women aged 18 to 50 do not meet the recommended dietary guidelines for iron intake. And if you're pregnant, menstruating, or following a vegetarian or vegan diet, your needs are even higher, and therefore you're more at risk. So that's why I often recommend Spartone. Now, this is a naturally sourced iron-rich water that comes from the Welsh Hills. It contains ferrous iron, the most absorbable form, with studies showing up to 40% absorption. So your body can actually use what it takes in. Now, it's also incredibly gentle. It's one natural ingredient, there's no harsh tablets, and there's no digestive issues. I use it myself, and it is my go-to in clinic. You can pick up Spartone at Boots, and if you've been feeling low on energy, it's absolutely worth checking in on your iron with your doctor or GP.
Well, I just find it so interesting because I think when we're thinking about the gut microbiome, we're always like, what am I doing and how is my environment affecting me? We're not thinking about our partner that we're sleeping with or our household. And, I guess, I don't know, is this a weird question to ask? If one partner had a less diverse microbiome and another partner had a more diverse microbiome, would the one that had more affect the one that had less? Or would it be that impactful or not?
I think, unfortunately, I mean, again, we need to know more about this, but it's kind of been seen as potentially the other way. Actually it's kind of going to maybe bring you down if you're the more the healthy one. Why that is, we don't know. But again, that could, I think we need to know more about whether that is the case or not. And, that's kind of curious because I think common sense would say it would be the other way around.
Yeah, I'm glad that you said that. It made me feel better.
No, absolutely. No, absolutely, because you think, you'd be sharing. But I think that's a question mark that we want to know more about.
I've got this moment now of Brian Johnson when he's interviewing who he's going on a date with his normal checklist, asking, how good is your gut microbiome? Because he doesn't want to get infected with poor quality microbiome. Yeah. This is the guy who's biohacking himself for, anti-aging protocols of 2 million a year. Interesting, really interesting. The other thing that I found quite interesting, and we were talking about diversity, is in there you said, does sexual preference make a difference to your gut microbiome? And you said it seems so because we don't know why yet, but men who have sex with men are more likely to have a more diverse gut microbiome than men who have sex with women.
Yeah, but of course this is a kind of pattern thing. So it could be that men who are having sex with men are kind of looking after themselves better. They're having a better diet, they're more fit. So I think, that's jury's still out on that, but I think it's a fun little signal of, is it there's something else going on there?
Yeah, it's fascinating. All these curious questions.
Yeah.
As you can tell, I was fascinated by this entire chapter. So essentially, my conclusion on this is that the more sex that we have with somebody who's got a good gut microbiome, the better our own gut microbiome will be.
I mean, I think sex is good health generally, right? So I think you're getting exercise, which we also know is related to a healthier gut microbiome. You're de-stressing, again, really important for your gut microbiome. So I think so often with the gut microbiome, we talk about food, and I totally get that because it's an easy thing we can change, and it's one of the main contributors to the gut microbiome. But I really like to also say, look, microbes are everywhere. And, we're interacting with different people. And again, even to take that to the point of, people who are really lonely tend to have a less diverse gut microbiome. And I think, there's so much about us collecting microbes from the environment we're in, the people that we're hanging out with. Sharing a meal, we're transferring microbes, shaking someone's hand, hugging them. So I think, that's really important. I mean, think about evolution. before humans were even on this planet, it was dominated by microbes. This is really, everywhere is owned by them. And we're probably more likely to be the parasites that they're harbouring.
So. 100%. I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah.
But I think it's an exciting kind of message to say sex is good for your gut microbiome. Human connection is good for your gut microbiome.
Absolutely.
You mentioned something there very interesting, which I really wanted to talk, the social gut versus the lonely gut. Because I know that we can talk a lot about food, but I think these common denominators of the gut aren't spoken about enough. And sometimes there's a reductionist view on just eating certain foods to help your gut microbiome flourish. When actually there's all these other common denominators that you can be doing. That sometimes might be a bit more fun for others as well. If you're not a foodie, knowing that you can pull these other levers as well is also important.
Yeah. And I think also, I think I posted something on Instagram a while back that it was I think it was a list of 10, 15 kind of surprising things that you're doing for gut health already. And kind of listing these things, spending time in nature. And I think people just to kind of give people a bit of, I think because gut health is such a trend, and it's quite often been taken, to, a lot of kind of bold claims being made. And yes, it is impactful, but we've got to find that scientific evidence base between that. But so many things that we're already doing are supporting our gut microbiome. And it's all those kind of, factors together. And I think going back to they're talking about a perfect diet, for example, and the stress that then causes.
Yeah, which we spoke about in the Compassionate Cure 5 questions earlier.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And saying that, that stress is then perhaps having more of a negative impact on your body and how you're feeling. So we know how powerful stress is. So of course we can't avoid it all the time.
No.
But we can help to manage it.
Which is essential.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned something then. I don't know if you remember the study, and I can always try and find it and we can come back to it, because I know when you write a book, you include so many incredible studies, you're not going to be able to remember each one. But, you have mentioned that studies now show links between the gut bacteria and personality traits like how conscientious we are and our empathy levels, which I find fascinating.
So are we just microbial zombies?
Yeah. That's
are we being
after watching
manipulated?
The Last of Us.
Oh yeah, Last of Us. Oh my
which
gosh,
is all about the
Watching that.
us turning into mycelium zombies.
Yeah, exactly.
When I read that line the day after I watched that series, I was like, well, I think Emily's onto something.
Yeah.
Yeah. How does our gut microbiome help these personality traits? More empathy, more conscientious. What do you remember the studies?
So this was a study where I was looking at the association. It found that certain microbes, certain types of bacteria were linked with being more conscientious or kind of also being more social. And we see this in mice as well, like the sociability element, that if you kind of take germ-free mice, for example, don't really like interacting with their fellow mice. And just seeing this sociability part really kind of playing a role with your gut microbes. And I think we don't know that much about this. It was kind of probably actually the one study I was kind of found about this personality link. But I think when we look at that in relation to what we see with the mice and the sociability and those changes, there's also been probiotic studies in mice that kind of shown that kind of giving certain probiotics and make them kind of feel kind of more hospitable. And perhaps that's where our microbes are playing a part. But I think when it comes to the gut microbiome, it tends to be that when the gut microbiome is in the gut, it's more in the driving seat. When it is coming to other aspects of our body, rather than perhaps being the full orchestra, it's kind of acting like kind of tuning the violin, making sure that, and just kind of fine tuning what's happening, but perhaps, it's very much more in this kind of supporting act. And I think when we look back again, we talk about this evolution where these gut microbes were here before us. We have co-evolved with these microbes. So we've learned to use their waste products. They've learned to kind of use us in ways to help them, feed on the food that we eat, to help them flourish and support them. So, perhaps there is kind of this element in that. And I think when we think about, for example, probiotics helping with sleep and helping with stress, is it so far-fetched that perhaps, tiny little tuning elements on certain aspects of our personality. But again, I think, we're talking about, I really prefer to talk about food and whole foods, because really that's what is feeding our gut microbes and helping them to flourish. And I think really going back to that dual aspect again of, you're getting the nutrition that you need for your brain and for your body, and then also supplying your microbes with the food they need to then produce all these different special molecules that kind of travel into your body and help to support your brain and your brain health. So yeah, kind of interesting little sprinklings of things. And I think we'll know, I mean, it's really only been the last, I say 5-10 years. I try to think when I started first working with the gut microbiome, even the way that we sequence and we understand what gut microbes are there and what they're doing has so changed. And technology, what it's given us and what we can understand now is just absolutely, it's so rapidly changing. I think the next 5-10 years will be phenomenal now that we have AI as well. I think it's just going to be so rapid. I think we're going to having things shooting back and forth.
Totally. I think that's the one part of AI that I'm very excited about is everything within the health sector. I think that feels to me within the medicine side of things with AI is really exciting. And I think maybe this is a good time to put it in about gut tests. Because I know we're speaking a lot about this, and I think most of my listeners who listen to the show will know about having the 30 plants a week and making sure we're having good amounts of fibre, which we can definitely go into in a bit. But I think the step before we get there is a lot of people then go, okay, well, I want to now figure out, where is my gut microbiome? Like, how many good gut microbes versus bad gut microbes do I have? Do I need to get more of some and less of the other? And it can feel very overwhelming. I mean, even for me as a nutritional scientist, I find it overwhelming because my opinion is that there is no gold standard test out there to test your gut microbiome. And the amount of influx that I have people coming to my clinic saying, can you just send me for a test? And the disappointment in their faces when I say, well, no, because there's not one that's going to legitimately tell me actually where your gut microbiome is. There's lots of fancy ones that are sold, but actually the science is kind of still not there. What is your perspective on this? Because I posted something yesterday on this, on influencers talking about fertility tests, gut microbiome tests, and people are spending a lot of money because it's not insecurity, but people are like, well, okay, this is a really big part of my health, so I'm going to spend the money to get the information. People really want to improve their health, but I feel like we're stuck in kind of a marketing machine around it.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very much in agreement with what you've said. Actually, a paper came out, I think a month or two ago, that was a, consensus statement of experts in the gut microbiome, and 90% of the experts agreed that the science just isn't there yet. What I tend to say is that, a few things. So, firstly, if you are wanting to get a gut microbiome test, just to know who's there for a bit of kind of fun, then, and you've got the money for it and you don't mind spending the money, then fine. But if you are thinking that it's going to help diagnose something, if you're thinking it's going to give you any advice that couldn't just be found elsewhere, then don't, because the science, we just don't have the science yet to give specific food advice, to give any kind of diagnosis. And really that's, £300-400 is so much money. And those core key principles of looking after your gut microbiome, as you say, kind of diversity of different plants, looking after, thinking about fibre, thinking about fermented foods and all these things are there, I've got them all listed in the book, are all, very much applicable to everybody. And actually, instead, I say that, the free way, the cheap way of looking after your gut health and seeing how healthy your gut is happening on a daily basis for most people. It's basically just looking in the toilet bowl and looking at your poo. Your body is telling you how healthy your gut is from literally how often you're going, what kind of colour it is, what the shape is, and if you're having any kind of digestive discomfort around there. So I talk about poo a lot. I'm a big believer in talking about poo, not talking about bowel movements or stools. I think...
So am I. This is what I talk about in clinic. And every patient who comes and looks at me like they're terrified to divulge, and I'm like, there's nothing you can say that is going to surprise me. But I'm trying to find, you've got this great little... Here we go. Yeah,
there's pictures of...
I'm just going to put this up to the screen to see. You can zoom in if you're watching on YouTube. I like it that you put it in the intestine.
Yeah, it's in the sausage packing factory.
Yeah.
It's on its way down and out.
Way. So you basically have lots of different ways that someone's stool can look. And can you just explain what's healthy Actually, I don't like using that word because that's quite reductionist. You know, what we
What are
think
we
would
looking
be
for?
a good
What are we hoping
stool.
for?
What's a good poo, Emily?
What is a good poo? Okay. So you're lifting out the toilet lid, you're having a look every single time you go, and we're looking for, I actually need anybody who wants to tell me how a better way of saying this, because I actually don't want to say a food related thing anymore, but we always talk about like a sausage. And I think we shouldn't be saying sausages. So I'm very, anybody who wants to message,
that can be taken in.
if anybody wants to message and give some better analogies, I'm working on it. So I'm open to it. So effectively you're looking for a smooth sausage or a sausage with cracks in it. If you are having kind of dry, kind of rabbit droppings and pebbles, that's more kind of constipation. That's going to probably feel quite uncomfortable. You're probably having a lack of water, lack of fibre, water helping to hydrate everything and keeping everything mushy enough to move through nicely. And then at the other end, when you've got kind of mushy poo, you know, maybe it's coming through very fast, you've got diarrhea. Again, that's something that, you know, fibre can also help with as well, but it also depends on that person. So you're looking for your sausage with cracks. What is healthy? You're going between 3 times a day to 3 times a week. So whatever is normal within that. If you're having a change in, you know, kind of how often you're going, that's lasting more than 3 weeks, that could also be a sign that maybe there's something going on. And then we're looking at the colour. So we want it to be brown, kind of nice, rich brown. If it is kind of red or black, that could be a sign that there's blood in the poo, and that could just mean that it's worth getting checked out with your GP. Might not be a problem, but it could be a risk factor for certain things happening. And then I talk about kind of also like, how are you feeling? Like, is it coming out nice and easily? Are you sitting on the poo stool? Are you sitting on the poo? Are you sitting on the stool?
Because you have this great
Are you sitting on the loo for ages?
where you should put your feet up, right, when you go to the bathroom, because that helps level. Is it the pelvis?
So it's kind of the rectum, the last bit that it's coming, you know, the kind of pipe that's coming, that the poo's coming out of. It can get kinked in the way that we kind of just sit normally. So actually you want to be more as if you're kind of squatting, like back in caveman times. So actually just having something simple, if you're really struggling and you've got constipation, or you're just feeling like it's just not coming out easily, pop your feet on a poo stool. Put on a stool, doesn't have to be a specific, you know, any stool.
There are poo stools that you can buy on Amazon.
Yes. And that just means you want your legs to kind of be kind of what we say perpendicular, so kind of parallel to the ground.
Yeah.
And that will just help to kind of straighten everything out and help things come through easily. So that's, and then, you know, again, to go back to this discomfort and how you're feeling, like, I always try and say to people, a little bit of bloating after a meal is totally normal. We're so obsessed with flat stomachs and thinking, oh my God, a bit of bloating is terrible. And da, da, da. But actually, that's probably a sign, if you've had a very fibre-rich meal, that's a sign of probably a healthy gut microbiome, because when those gut microbes feed on the fibre, yes, they make those special molecules, but they also make a bit of gas as a side effect. So yeah, feeling a bit bloating for an hour after meal, absolutely fine. If you want to go for a walk, you know, that will help to things to feel more comfortable. Do some farts if you need to. Again, a total normal thing. Kind of, you know, let it all out. But if you are having bloating that is staying up and feeling very uncomfortable throughout the day, again, that's something that, you know, a few probably diet and lifestyle things can perhaps help. And you know, I think so many people live with having kind of digestive problems and thinking that it's normal to feel like that, or there's nothing I can do about it. Please, 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 please go and see a qualified nutritionist, dietitian, go to your GP, get a referral, whatever it is, just seek some help, because it is, I just see time and time again, people just suffering and thinking that they should just get on with it. And actually, you know, please don't. I really kind of call to action there to get it sorted if you can.
And I think also, like, living in that chronic state is not good for our mental health. You know, there's so many connections between the brain and the gut. And I think when you are living constantly in pain, or there's something going on there, like, it does affect how you're feeling. It can make you feel more depressed or more anxious.
Yeah.
You know, there is a direct link there. We know people that have IBD or IBS have higher levels of depression and anxiety.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think, you know, thinking about that connection is really key. when it comes to our gut microbiome as well. Not
Yeah.
just thinking, oh, okay, well, it's just because I'm in pain. It's like, actually, this is going to be affecting my overall performance, how I'm feeling, my happiness, all of these things together.
Yeah. And it's really a two-way street. I think we've recognised for a long time that when you feel stressed, that you either rushing to the bathroom because you've got diarrhea, but for some people it's constipation, things will really slow down. But now it's like, yes, this is going back the other way because our gut is very chatty, and it's telling, it's feeding back information to our brain. And I think, again, going back to this feeling sick in our stomach, and that kind of actually in a kind of, more kind of everyday level, that is that happening, and kind of feeding back information.
So linking to mental health now, my real area of love, is ADHD, autism and neurodiversity. Now, I only really kind of noticed this as you sat down. I became quite engrossed in, as you can tell from what I was asking you at the beginning, female and gut microbiomes. But with ADHD, autism and neurodiversity, it is a big conversation. We've had Dr. Chris Palmer on the show talking a lot about metabolic health and how it affects our, different neurodivergent traits. What is the research on this? Because I think this is such an interesting area. It's one that's becoming such a big topic of conversation as more and more people are, as they're getting older, getting a late diagnosis of a neurodivergent trait. So is there any research?
Yeah, so I would say it's blowing up on Instagram a lot about the connection that we currently see, which I think is overstated versus what we have in terms of the evidence. What we tend to see in humans is that people with ADHD tend to have a kind of more slightly different gut microbiome. Whether that is a problem or not, who knows, but we just see a kind of slight kind of shift. Talking about autism, we also see that as well, that there's a slightly different gut microbiome. But I think, again, these are like patterns, and it's quite difficult for us to know whether that actually is kind of a strong relationship with the gut microbiome, maybe kind of causing kind of certain different traits. And I think, with autism, I think a really important example here is that, people with autism tend to have quite different diets, can kind of struggle to have that kind of variety of diet. And actually, are we just seeing that difference in the gut microbiome because it just happens to quite often be a different kind of diet happening? In mice, I think we see that perhaps, when they kind of try and model certain things, that, certain kind of probiotics in mice have maybe just helped to kind of ease certain traits. So it might be that if you're really struggling with sleep, that's been something that's kind of just been kind of helped with. But I think we're really cautious about not overstating gut health. And I think this is where gut health has become like, it's just grown legs and wings, and I think just kind of reeling it back in. And I think there will be more research on this area as we come along. But I think, could it be that looking after your gut microbiome might just help you kind of, if you are struggling with certain aspects, you may not be. Could it be that just looking after gut microbiome is one kind of little piece in the puzzle in that? But I think we've got to be really careful that if something's a factor, then great. And maybe that's something you can work with, but also not overstating that, this is all, cause quote unquote, or this or that. And I think that's really important to just be careful on the middle ground there. So until we have more research, let's see.
It's interesting how you're talking about the guts going up to obviously the direction going up to the brain. I'm also like, well, if somebody's neurodivergent, are they having different signals going down to the gut? Because it's bidirectional. Is it both ways? Is it directing the gut in a different way than a neurotypical brain?
We're all, unique and different in our own way, as is our gut microbiome. Our gut microbiome is as unique as a fingerprint. Perhaps we are just all as unique in a fingerprint, and it doesn't necessarily, mean anything unless you're looking for, support with a certain, I guess, a dial of a certain trait or kind of symptom that's happening that you're wanting to maybe just, dial down, but you may not want to or need to. I think that's very individual, unique decision. But, perhaps it's just that, we are different. Our microbiome's different. We all work slightly differently, and our microbes and our brains are communicating in a slightly different way and therefore appearing slightly different.
Well, it's interesting because if we take the fact, which is people that have IBS, have higher levels of anxiety, especially in women with ADHD and also men, but it's been seen quite a big link in women that have anxiety is actually connected to ADHD. Well, if we think about anxiety in the gut microbiome, it would be affecting it because it is having that direct link. We know that stress causes a difference in the gut microbiome. So it makes logical sense in the way of how I'm thinking about it.
Yeah.
And looking at foods and lifestyle practices to support the gut microbiome could be a really healthy factor for people that are neurodivergent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really that, I think that stress is such a key element because, is this why we see this relationship with sleep? It's because actually it's that kind of communication between the gut microbiome and stress and kind of both ways. And actually that can then, has a knock-on effect, because I think we so often think about stress as just being in our head, but it's not. It's in our entire body. And that then making things kind of like a domino effect kind of elsewhere.
Yeah, I completely agree. Well, thinking about the food we mentioned, but something that I found really interesting, which you mentioned very briefly in the 5 questions for the compassionate cure, is the environmental microbes. And you mentioned a study about adults simply rubbing their hands in soil 3 times a day. They saw an increase in their gut diversity within 2 weeks. So I guess, are we too clean for our own good is a question.
Well, that's a hypothesis that's kind of very well known about the hygiene hypothesis, which is like, are we too quick with a Dettol spray and I shouldn't say a kind of brand, but just, spraying things left, right and centre and, recognising that, yes, there are kind of harmful microbes that we want to be getting rid of, but actually there's many that are friendly and harmless too. And, with these microbes all around us on every single surface, but particularly in soil is, perhaps one of the most, kind of microbial, rich and dense, kind of populated. And just spending time with soil is just, it's changing our microbiome of our skin.
Wow.
And then if we think how often, we're touching things and then perhaps eating them, we're touching our face, that then is then probably kind of going down into our gut microbiome. And we see with studies of gardeners, for example, gardeners tend to have a more diverse gut microbiome. Actually, how many shrubs and plants you have in your garden is also meant to be a signal of. So, but that could be that maybe those people are keen gardeners and therefore more likely to spend time in the garden. And I say, if you don't have space for a garden, can you get a little house plant and or get outside and just join a community garden or hang out in the park. And that is such a kind of, we're breathing them in, and actually I think, we've really got to recognise, we talk a lot about fermented foods being, containing these live microbes, but actually, everything that we touch and eat has live microbes in it. An apple has 100 million live microbes. And that's within it because it's got a little plant microbiome. So we're constantly kind of taking these microbes in from all around us.
Wow. I love that. 80 million from transferring a kiss for 10 seconds.
Yeah.
And an apple, 100 trillion microbes.
100 million.
100
yes.
million. I don't know where trillion came from. That was me really getting ahead of myself.
There's so many trillions in, yeah.
Another thing that I find really interesting is we're obviously now quite obsessed with aging in the conversation of health and longevity. And it's a very big one that many people are trying to biohack. One of my least favourite words. But it's interesting. I think, dementia is the leading cause of death in the UK anyway. Cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death in America. A lot of people are talking now about the gut connection with the brain and the mind and potentially Alzheimer's. Where, I know you touch on it very briefly in the book, but where are we currently with the research on that?
Yeah, so we think that perhaps, these kind of signals kind of happen in the gut, and that's kind of early stages. And I think when we think actually about the bigger picture of the research, we see that diet seems to play a role in, preventing Alzheimer's. But there's a relationship there earlier on, but actually when you're kind of in the sticks of things, it's very difficult for us to perhaps see any kind of sizable difference. And could it be that, this kind of relationship with the gut is something that we can then kind of change, and it's basically kind of lever for us to get involved with. We see the same with Parkinson's disease as well. people can have constipation up to 20 years earlier before they see any motor symptoms. And, is there then this relationship with the gut that's happening? And we see, again, people with Parkinson's, people with Alzheimer's tend to have a different gut microbiome, but they also tend to have lower levels of these special molecules called short-chain fatty acids, which are produced and made by your gut microbiome when they feed on fibre. So I think it's really interesting, again, to see what might play out in that. But I think, we haven't talked, I just think the everyday kind of context and language that we talk about health, brain health just doesn't seem to get talked about. And I think we kind of think of it, oh, well, I'll look after it when there's a problem. But actually, we all need to be thinking about our brain health right now. And this is the impact that we could be making, 20, 30 years from any time before, if we can really be thinking about that. And I think I really talk about in the book a lot is actually really just about, I think we've talked about health and how can we prevent a disease and illness later in life for quite a long time. And yes, that's really important. That's how we work as researchers. We tend to look at diseases or conditions. But actually, the food we eat and our health is our day-to-day. It's our mood, it's our energy. It is kind of that joie de vivre, that is health as well. And all those days, those are kind of literally all kind of bundled together for your health across your lifetime. So there's kind of, impacts in making a difference right now. And, again, I think I talk a few about those in studies in the book as well about, people eating more fruits and vegetables across 8 weeks tended to be happier than the kind of other group, and kind of little kind of seeing these kind of signals and changes, and kind of psychologists looking at people's kind of diaries and their kind of, their emotions, but also the foods that they'd eaten, and seeing that people who said they were more happy, it tended to be related to, tended to be eating more fruits and vegetables the day before, but they didn't see that kind of the other way around.
No, I do. When I give food diaries out to my patients who come in, we obviously have kind of like write everything down. And one of the columns is, are you eating alone or are you eating with people? Another column is, how are you feeling? The social context. How long did it take you to eat this food? Like, there's a lot of different columns. It's not just about the food, because for me, they don't work in isolation. If somebody is grabbing a last minute sandwich, running to the tube, mindlessly stressed, answering an email, that's a completely different context to sitting down with the same sandwich with somebody having a great conversation, or maybe being on FaceTime to their mum and talking while they're having their sandwich and being mindful, or sitting in a park and looking out across and just noticing what's going on around them just for 10 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a very different context.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing, that we can become so siloed on like one thing, which is, interestingly enough, like we have touched on the food here, but I've not wanted to make that the main part of this conversation, because I think we've done a few conversations on the gut microbiome and it's become very specific on food, which I think is great. But I think there's such a bigger context when it comes to our gut health. And especially when we look at mindfulness studies and relationship to the gut microbiome, things that have really helped my own personal gut health isn't the food. It's actually a lot of the other things I've done alongside it, taking more time for myself, being more kind to myself, not rushing around, becoming more mindful, doing breathing exercises, doing more somatic body work, like cranial sacral, where it relaxes your nervous system. My body feels in a different state. And then I feel way more connected to the things that maybe I want to eat and should be eating, as opposed to having this checklist of things I know I have to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's why I felt so strongly when I was writing the book that I wanted, I put it kind of a gut-brain mindset, which is, your relationship with food and how you're approaching eating. So, are we just looking for kind of small, consistent changes, but actually, don't sweat it if it's not perfect. We don't want perfect. Talking about food rules and how damaging that can actually be. And actually, I talk a lot about, can we make those changes most days? And I think that's so important that we think about the whole thing. So I talk about, I have that chapter on loneliness. I have, in the kind of 10 hacks at the end, there's, a whole chapter on breathing techniques, to really kind of just wrap it all together. But again, it's like so small, simple things that we can be doing that aren't going to break the bank, that don't. And I think, again, it's the mental load of having to, do things that seem very complex. And I just really want to break that down and say gut health doesn't have to be complicated. I think it's been way overcomplicated. Let's just go back to what are the small, important things that you can be doing that completely intuitively fit within, you don't have to do any complicated weighing or counting. It's just, what are the key principles that you can apply that are very simple and that you can just be like, yeah, I've got it. Right, I'm going to move on with my life. And then that brain, span opens up to the fun and your work, because everybody's spinning too many plates.
I know, it's exhausting.
Yeah, life is too short. So yeah, hopefully this is going to just take some of that load off and just support your health and well-being in many different ways.
So I know that you had 10, but I want to break that down into 5. So if there's 5 things that someone, and I hate, this sounds like such a clip, but it's not meant to be. It's kind of, this is the practical side of someone's like, okay, well, this is really interesting. We've gone through the aging brain, we've gone through the environmental factors, we've gone through connection, we've gone through sex, we've gone through female and male health. It's really interesting, and I've taken away lots of practical things that one can do. But if someone was like, now, okay, I'm going to finish this episode, I'm going to go and do 5 things to implement over the next couple of weeks, what would you want those 5 things to be?
First off, I'd say focus on fibre. Fibre has been, forgotten and thinking it all just kind of some shoddy reputation of being bland and boring, just something that helps you have a nice smooth poo. Yes, it does that, and we should be giving it, lots of credit for that. But it has so many benefits, and I joke about it as being a bit like, when Lois Lane hangs out with Clark Kent from Superman, and she just thinks he's some kind of boring, well, kind of nice, but slightly dull, man. And he's actually Superman flying around in this cape. And I think fibre really is that kind of closest thing to a superfood. It's not just helping with our gut microbiome, but it's great for our heart health. It's great for our metabolic health. There's so many things that we can be, doing more. But for our gut microbiome, it is really its favourite food. And 93% of us are not eating enough fibre. So it's
that's a huge stat. I wrote that down earlier because you mentioned that in our 5 questions. And I haven't brought it up yet, but it did shock me. That's gone up since I last looked at the statistics, actually, which kind of surprises me because I feel that we speak more about health than ever before. I don't know why it's going up.
Well, on average, we're eating about 20 grams of fibre a day in the UK. That's slightly up from kind of 18, which it was before. That's still a deficit of kind of 35-40%. So I think just for me, that signals that, that is one really simple, impactful change that you can make for your health. And the beauty of fibre-rich foods, they're also densely packed with many other nutrients that are going to mean that you kind of naturally meet your nutritional needs in many other ways as well. So that is probably my first one. Second one, I'm like, okay, we've talked about fibre, but we just don't seem to know day to day what the high fibre foods are. I think we're very quick at knowing what the high protein foods are. I'll say to someone, list it off the top of your head. They'll say meat, eggs, fish. Can we do the same for fibre? And actually say, whoever's listening, please, think, is anything coming to mind? And no, we don't have to be stuck on, dry, dusty brown flakes or kind of bland wholemeal bread. Fibre is found in fruits, vegetables, beans, legumes, whole grains, nuts and seeds. So we've got this wide variety of fibre and lots of different fibre types that help support our health. So I talk a lot in the book about what I call the BGBGs, which is a little bit like, the Bee Gees, 70s band, Saturday Night Fever. So we're throwing our gut microbes a party. And they're affected. So BGBGS, so beans, greens, berries, grains as in whole grains, and then seeds as in nuts and seeds. And actually of those, it's the beans, whole grains, and nuts and seeds that tend to contain the most fibre. So I think that's quite surprising often because I think, yes, we want more fruits and vegetables. But to make it really easy for us to hit that 30 grams of fibre a day that's recommended, if we're focusing on having a handful of nuts a day as a snack, I keep them in a jar by my kettle so I can kind of see it when I'm making a cup of tea. If we can getting, berries most days also contain, lots of polyphenols that are really important for our brain. They tend to be the most kind of fibre-rich fruit. Frozen berries, chuck them onto your breakfast, have them as a snack or have fresh, whatever works for you. And then Oh, sorry, I feel like I was talking about berries and beans. I wanted the wrong bee. You got that. There's an extra bee. But beans, we could be eating so much more of. Just half a can contains 7 grams of fibre. So that for most people could, just by adding that in, that's, you're already nearly hitting your 30 grams. Yeah. We just need a little kind of extra top up. And then the whole grains, I think when people say, I really want to invest in my gut health, I say, if you're going to spend money on something, spend it on the things that are going to make it easier for you to eat healthily. So that could be kind of, those pre-cooked sachets of spelt or grains. That for me is like, if I'm going to splurge on something, it's those kind of things, because they are expensive. You don't have to. You can, buy them in bulk and pre-cook them. But that's where I'd be putting my investment if you're going to spend money. Those simple things are going to make it easier for you.
So we've got fibre.
Yes.
What's 2, 3, 4, and 5?
Okay. And then we talk about diversity. I'm actually not a big fan of the 30 plants a week message. The reason for that is that I think it's very individual. I think if somebody really likes that and they find it easy, then great. And I think the message of diversity is really important. We do want a range of different things. But I prefer to talk about colours of different fruits and vegetables, giving you lots of different, we talk about polyphenols, which are also good for the gut microbiome, lots of different types of fibres, and also thinking about food groups across the day.
Yeah.
The reason I'm not that hot on the 30 plants a week message is that it's actually just based on one study, which is a kind of guesstimated survey question. So it's not even rigorously corrected dietary data. It's literally, how many plants do you think you've eaten across the week? And the people who said that they ate 30 plants or more likely were probably just eating more fruits and vegetables overall. And I think when practically for many people, writing down every single plant you eat every single day can feel really overwhelming. And especially, if you're like, oh, well, I ate a tomato on Monday, so I can't have it on Wednesday. And then you've got loads of food waste left over, and it can be really expensive. So I think if you find that works for you, great, but don't feel like it's the be all and end all. Kind of take the message, the core message, which is, yes, let's have a more diverse diet. We know that. But again, finding that sweet spot for you and your lifestyle, and not feeling like you have to write single thing down.
No, that's not healthy.
Yeah.
So fibre, diversity,
and then we're going to talk about, so I mentioned about polyphenols. So polyphenols are effectively these kind of plant compounds that give the colour to many fruits and vegetables that we know and love. And we think of them almost as acting a little bit like how fibre does and feeding the gut microbes. And so by getting a range of different colours, you're then getting a range of different polyphenols. And not just great for your gut, also great for your brain as well. And we see kind of studies with particularly the ones found in berries, for example, really helping to support your kind of cognition and keeping you feeling alert and focused. And then I think we'd really have to talk about that stress element, right?
Yeah.
And talking about breathing and
breathing's number 4. What would you say number 4 is?
So number 4, well, I feel like, I think we could talk about fish. There's so many things. Fermented foods.
No, wait, you just said stress. Did you not think that should be one of them?
Well, one of them is, yes. Where are we at for...
So we've basically got fibre, diversity, polyphenols.
Yes. So we need 2 more.
So we need 2 more.
Yeah. So we've got fermented foods and stress. Let's do that.
Fermented foods, yeah, but you got to narrow me in. Can't be stress. I'm being really strict now. It's got to be
we're just doing
applicable.
food. Yes.
No, it's got to be, no, we can be anything. The 5 things that people can do for their gut health.
Yes, so I was going to say breathing techniques.
Breathing technique. Okay, right. These are our 5. This is what we're doing with Live Well, Be Well, Gut Health.
There we go.
Okay, so let's go to fermented then.
Fermented foods. The research, there was a great study that came out a couple of years ago that showed that 6 servings of fermented foods a day is linked with, kind of caused increased microbial diversity, so a more healthy gut microbiome, and lowered measures of inflammation. So that feels, I think, very overwhelming for people. 6 servings, kind of, oh my gosh, I've got to fit all these in. Actually, that, I think often with these studies, how we do them is that we tend to make them quite a big change, so that we can make sure that we can see an impact across what is a relatively short period of time, which is a couple of, weeks or months. So actually making those changes, even if they're smaller, but more consistently over time. So let's say months or years, even if it's kind of 1 or 2 servings, is still going to have a benefit. We still see this in, and we see this in other studies that, even 100 grams of kind of live microbial foods, which can not just be, your fermented foods, but also we talked about, fruits and vegetables containing live microbes, is also kind of seen to be a great thing. In terms of the research, when we talk about individual fermented foods, it tends to be that kefir has the most research behind it. So if you're starting on a fermented food, start with kefir. It has the most impact from what we know so far in terms of how much research has been done. Kombucha is an interesting one because I think it gets a lot of airtime, but actually we've only had a handful of very small kind of human studies on it. So kind of just to kind of bring that into context. And then we want to talk about
breathing.
And breathing.
I've made you pick one because I think stress is such a encompassing word but it's like, what's the one thing that we can do for our gut health? And so breathing, you feel, is one of the key levers that we can pull. I mean, breathing's essential to be alive, but breathing techniques.
I think when we can't avoid stress, right?
No.
For me, it's very much breathing techniques are a great tool to help us manage that stress. And I really like breathing techniques versus, I think people are a fan of yoga, great, go for it. But actually you want something that, you can use right in the here and now, whether you are standing in the queue, at the supermarket and wanting to kind of probably, maybe punch the person in front of you, or you're feeling incredibly, or you're in a meeting and, your blood levels are kind of rising and you're thinking, oh God. These breathing techniques, you can often, so many of them you can just do and nobody notices you're doing them.
Yeah.
So, I just think really great. So there's kind of box breathing, which is effectively kind of breathing in for 4, holding for 4, breathing out for 4, holding for 4. So again, really simple. Or just kind of letting out a really long sigh. So kind of just sighing out, hold it for a second, then sigh out a bit more.
The psychological sigh. It's great.
There we go.
And these are techniques that actually the Navy SEALs use, which for anyone who, I don't think anyone listening to the show thinks it's woo-woo because it's so rooted in science. But I feel like when I say that to people, they go, oh, really? Like some of the toughest men on the planet use these breathing techniques to get their nervous systems regulated.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the performance as well. That's exactly why they're getting themselves in the zone. They're calming themselves down. And, that's, stress. It's, if we can't avoid it because everyday life, can we help ourselves manage it? And that's really kind of a key way that I like to kind of talk about it.
Amazing. So we've got fibre, diversity, polyphenols, fermented foods, which kind of in a way I feel like all encompass, I know it sounds like a lot, but it all kind of encompasses the same types of foods. It's all your whole grains, your plant-based foods, basically. That is that sector. And then a breathing technique as well, whichever one you feel works for you. I think that's a really, I want to say achievable, but things that people can work towards to try and start supporting their gut microbiome.
Absolutely. And I think it's, finding that first thing that works for you, slotting that into your life, making that a habit, and then, maybe picking up the next thing. And then if you feel that life's getting a bit too tough and stressful, it's okay to step back a little bit and then just, get back on. It's a little bit like, if your sat nav is taking you in a certain direction, if you go down a wrong route, you don't suddenly say, oh my God, that's it. I'm going to go back. I'm going to just chuck everything in the bin. You think, okay, we're going in a slightly different route. I'm going to refigure myself back on, and you keep on going.
And
so
you actually probably might have a better journey. You might see something that's you never expected to see.
Exactly.
So Emily, this has been an amazing conversation and different, which I'm really happy about. I feel like, it's really important to talk. The gut microbiome is as individual as somebody's fingerprint. And I love that we kind of made it even more individual, looking at men versus women, which I think is important, and not just categorizing it into one. But I always leave with one question to all of my guests, which is, Emily, what does live well, be well mean to you?
I think it means connection, joy, making peace with the grey.
I love that. Making peace with the grey. All the beauty is found in the grey areas. So
yeah, exactly. We just need to kind of step back a little bit.
You should have answered that as the fifth answer for the compassionate cure 5 questions. Peace with the past.
I know, we could sneak that in.
That would have been great. Thank you. And I know that you are writing your next book, so I'm excited to get you back on when that is done. It's an accomplishment. So I know you're deep in the writing process at the moment. So hopefully we can have the pleasure of having you back on when you've released your second book.
Thank you.